Hello, and welcome to another Sagely Health webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about clinical trials with Dr. Jason Sager. Dr. Sager is the CEO and founder of Sagely Health, and a cancer expert and an expert in clinical trials. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Jeremy.
I was wondering if we could begin. Could you talk a little bit about your background and how you became an expert in clinical trials? How have you been involved? What have you been exposed to?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you know, I am a physician, an oncologist by training, trained at the NCI and Johns Hopkins. And it was really right from the very beginning of my training, which was in pediatric oncology, that I learned all about clinical trials. Unlike adult oncology, in pediatric oncology, almost all of our patients belongs to and gets enrolled into a clinical trial. And it's by virtue of having done that I came to understand that this is why we've done so well in pediatric oncology. Over the years, I saw patients whose situations were very severe at the very beginning of my training, to being like 80% cured by the end of my training. And it was incredible. I then went on to do drug development formally in the likes of Genentech, Novartis, and Sanofi. And all throughout, really helping new drugs to get through their clinical trials and go from basically an unknown drug to one that was approved for patients and cancer patients, offering them new hope and new cures. And so now that I'm part of Sagely Health and founded this company 8 years ago, I'm really excited about the prospect of clinical trials and know that it's a barrier for many patients to understand and access. And that's one of the primary reasons that I wanted to form Sagely Health, is to really give those patients an opportunity to access innovative therapies, oftentimes found on clinical trials, to do better and come out with their best possible outcome.
Excellent. Let's take a step back. Let's talk about what are clinical trials and why are clinical trials run? Yeah.
So let's start with the why, right? Clinical trials basically are run because you have a medicine, and this medicine, it's called an intervention, and it's one that scientists have worked on for probably years to get ready to go into people. There's a series of tests that every medicine needs to go through even before being entered into the clinic. Once it's okayed by the FDA to go into the clinic, it begins on this path of clinical trials. Clinical trials are a series of basically studies where greater and greater numbers of patients are exposed to the medicine to find out, hey, how safe is it? What are the side effects? And then how efficacious is it? Is it going to work in all cancer types, some cancer types, one particular, let's say, a genetic targeted approach? There's lots of questions to be asked. And those questions are all answered by the series of clinical trials. The other side of that is that these drugs come out then and get formally approved and then can be utilized by any oncologist anywhere in the United States by just writing a script for the patient. And so after that, it's less regulated, and thus, we really accumulate the knowledge of its safety and efficacy right in the clinical trial space.
So is it fair to say that any cancer drug that is given to a patient, or really any intervention that's given to a patient, has gone through clinical trials?
Absolutely. Today, I'd say that, I don't know of a situation in which an approved U.S. drug that's used for cancer has not gone through formal clinical trials. There are, obviously, other countries that run clinical trials or drug development in different ways. Most of them have adopted the regulations that the U.S. use and the same sort of infrastructure, and it's a strong one, right? These are, patients don't have to worry when looking at a clinical trial. These are heavily regulated, looked at up and down. Scientists have seen them, doctors have seen them, the hospitals that they're being run at have seen them. They've even got special institutional review boards called IRBs to review these. And everyone believes that these drugs that are coming down the pike really have a chance of doing better than our standard of care. And that last part is why I'm so excited to bring them to patients sooner rather than later. It's not the only way of getting patients innovative therapies, but it is one of the easiest ways for us because, again, they're looking for specific patients. And when we find those specific patients, it really means that they think the drug is going to do better for those people. And they often do.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating because you could have as a drug company, you could have developed a drug which is going to be a blockbuster drug. And everyone there kind of knows it's going to work, but that's still going to go through clinical trials. It's just part of our regulatory system. So there is a group of people who are just getting kind of early access to that. I mean, in the cases where it really is, as you say, like works very well. And and I also want to point out that we're talking about clinical trials for cancer. When clinical trials are kind of a broader umbrella that could include everything from dermatology to psychology to everything else. So I think when I've talked to some patients about clinical trials, I do kind of hear concerns about, I won't know what I'm getting in the trial. I might get the wrong drug, or they may give me a placebo. So can you talk a little bit about what is the structure and what are those things? Like, what's a comparison study? What's a placebo? What does blinded mean?
Yeah. And before I will answer that, I think you mentioned something sort of in transit that I wanted to kind of harp on or bring back to, which is that clinical trials have also changed over the years. And the clinical trials that were done 30 or 50 years ago no longer resemble the clinical trials that are being done today.
Yeah.
For example, in the old way of looking at things, patients would be kind of randomly assorted into these trials. And, oftentimes they were done so with the message that there's no hope here. That has really gone away. So even phase 1 trials, which, yesterday were poo-pooed because, none of them ever work. No, actually, those are some of the best trials now because A, you're going to be getting the drug, which we'll talk about in a moment. But B, if you match the scientific rationale, the reason that trial is being run, let's say there's a KRAS mutation or a HER2 amplification. There's a million reasons why a patient may match a trial and a drug better than average. Those are the patients that the trial is looking for because they think they will do better and often do. That's the same reason we want to bring it to the patient earlier because they often do better. And so from my perspective, there's really been a sea change in the way clinical trials are being run today compared to how they were run even 10 or 15 years ago. And that's, I think, an important concept.
Yeah, I was listening to some of the work of Dr. Farber, and I mean, just an amazing contribution to cancer treatment. But it was really clear that there was a point at which they had a chemical. They didn't really know if it would interact or how it would interact, and they would test it out. And so we're in a period of cancer treatment that is really much more insight based. Like there is a valid reason. It's not the existence of a chemical that can be tested. It is the existence of a well thought out theory of what might happen.
Right. And not only do we have well thought out theories that are driving the development of these medicines, these again have been through rigorous scientific experiments and testing to prove that it works the way that the scientists hypothesize and theorize that it's supposed to work. One of the most exciting things is from the drug development side when you get to put those into people and show that, yes, indeed, it's working against the cancer in the way that everyone thought it should. And again, those important sort of studies are being run not at the end of development, but right in the beginning. And so there's a fantastic sort of way of getting value for early drug development and drugs that will later on become the future cures of cancer. But we can get those future cures to cancer patients today. And that's an exciting prospect.
Okay, so then let's go back and say, okay, there's a drug company that has a well scientifically backed theory on a drug, and they've gone through all the necessary studies to get to the point of a clinical trial. So if a patient is considering a clinical trial, like let's talk about the comparison arms and that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I wanted to mention that there was a sort of the way that drug development started years ago. we still have a lot of those in place today. Some of them for better, some of them not so much for better.
Right.
And so let's talk about some of those. Again, most of our patients and clients that we serve at Sagely Health, they've heard of things like placebo. And frankly, no one wants a placebo, especially when you have cancer. What do you mean you're not going to treat me with drugs, right? The fact is that 99.5%, almost all oncology trials, do not have a placebo. And there's a very good reason for it, which is that the world, the scientific world, the FDA and everyone else believes that it would be unethical to treat patients who have cancer with nothing, right? So really what we're talking about is that everyone who comes into a clinical trial with cancer is going to have some sort of treatment. That treatment will often be the very best thing that the system has to offer, the standard of care. Okay, that's a lot different than getting treated with a placebo. So to me, it's really between that and then what's on the other side is usually the same standard plus something else, plus this new medicine that they think, gosh, this could be really powerful. Or maybe there's no standard left, and so therefore they just give the medicine. And then there's not a placebo and there's not randomization. And so let's talk about randomization. But I just wanted to first start off with this idea that placebos really are not something that exists very much in the cancer space.
So let me make sure I have this right. So the idea is that if you do have a comparison, meaning you're going to have two different groups of cancer patients in your trial, one group is going to get the new, hopefully innovative drug, maybe in combination with what's standardly given, maybe alone, but they're getting something new. That's what's being tested. And the other cohort, if there's a comparison, they're going to get the standard of care, kind of the gold standard of what it is recommended to give a cancer patient in their exact situation, their cancer type, their stage.
Right. So so for certain trials, and oftentimes those trials are the phase 3 trials, what we call confirmation trials, we already know and expect that the drug is going to work. And now we want to confirm in larger populations exactly how well it works.
Gotcha.
The easiest way to do that is to have two groups, one of whom gets that standard of care and one of whom gets the new therapy, usually in addition to the standard of care. And by comparing these two groups, we get to say, okay, well, how much of a difference is there? Is it a huge difference where patients in one arm or one group are living far longer than the other, or not? And even in these sort of randomized situations where a patient who's coming in has, it may be a 50-50 shot, it may be that there's some more chance of getting on to the new combination called a 2-to-1 randomization. So, but bottom line is you don't know as a patient which of these arms you're going to get. And sometimes those arms are blinded. Sometimes they're not. So sometimes the patient will know which arm that they belong to and whether they're getting the standard of care or the special combination. Or sometimes they're told, they're getting one or the other. And so sometimes the doctor knows and many times the doctor doesn't know. And so these are done to reduce bias. And we all understand that. Again, in cancer, it's probably a little overdone, but again, as you mentioned, these things apply for more than just cancer, so they're going across the entire clinical trial space. I think it's an important concept, though, for patients to understand that, again, if this is available to them, if they don't join the trial, they're going to get the standard of care. If they join the trial, they still may get the standard of care. They may get something that's the standard of care plus what, again, this new medicine that the science thinks will do better for them. And so to me, there's really little downside of joining a clinical trial, and there is a significant chance, even with randomization, that there's an upside. And I'll just leave you with it. Certainly, we work with cancer patients and our clients at Sagely Health. If there is an opportunity to join an earlier phase trial, like a phase 2 or a phase 1, where we know what the drug is and there's no randomization, it's nice. It's always much nicer. That being said, we don't shy away from a trial just because it has the randomization.
Yeah, I think there's a misconception that, we see, and sometimes we're able to convince people otherwise, but that there's this experimental thing that is a clinical trial that's very different from the treatment, and they have to step away from the standard treatment to go in the trial, when in reality it's really standard treatment plus, and more in most cases. And that's why the drugs are being tested, because a whole bunch of people and a whole lot of money is bet on the fact that this is going to be better than the standard treatment that exists now.
Yeah. And that's where, again, a source of comfort and confidence can come in patients, because, again, there's no less than, tens of millions. Usually it's about $30 million just to be able to test the drug through its what we call proof of concept, just to know that it's working in the right way. Then it's hundreds of millions of dollars afterwards. Of course, we all hope that cost will be reduced one day so that we can see more drugs coming through faster. But today, that's what it is. And so, investors have to really believe that this is a drug that's going to succeed in order for it to be tested in people. In addition to the scientists, the doctors, the hospitals, and the FDA. And so there's a lot of folks who are weighing in on this. And again, we've done spectacularly well in bringing patients to clinical trials. On those clinical trials, and in our hands, patients are living on the average of 2 years more than what they'd be expected to otherwise. And so I'd say that, there's a lot of different data out there and reports out there, but in our hands, we really believe that clinical trials represents an opportunity for patients to access innovative care, the future cancer cures and the future cancer standards today instead of tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to think about the idea that, we are doing better and better in cancer over time. So if that's the case and it's still going to go up, you can just kind of jump on there earlier, right? You can jump the chart a little bit. And in some cases a lot. I mean, we're looking at, years to decades for some drug approvals to get all the way to the general public, and tens of thousands of patients are diagnosed in that time with the particular drugs or the particular cancers that drug will be effective in.
Yeah.
So when a drug company has decided to make the investment in trying to get a drug to market and beginning this process, and they're going to run clinical trials, where do clinical trials get run? Like, are they at certain medical centers? Are there certain places in the United States?
Yeah.
How does this get decided?
Yeah. And again, from my drug development hat, I know this system very well. So when a drug is going into the clinic for the very first time, called a first-in-human trial, specialty centers are being selected to run those studies. These centers oftentimes have a lot of what we call phase 1 experience, or even a dedicated phase 1 group. And so they're trained and they're experienced to know how to recognize side effects of therapies, of new medicines, how to treat those, how to make sure that they don't become too severe. And so oftentimes those specialty clinics are being used at first, and but very rapidly, once you go beyond sort of that initial what we call dose escalation, where the drug is finding the right dose, you then begin to expand in areas where, again, the cancer type or specific mutation or genetic alteration in the cancer matches the hypothesis of the drug, the reason for it being. And so from my perspective, it's that expansion that already breaks outside of the traditional phase 1 groups and is really usually distributed geographically. So again, they don't want to load everything up in one state. They want, drug companies want to make sure that patients all over have access. Again, a lot of this is about decreasing bias. And so that is the way drug companies think about it. Oftentimes, the other aspect is, does one hospital already have other drugs that are similar, or already have too many drugs that they're developing? Well, let's go to a hospital that doesn't have as many drugs. We're certainly not going to compete with this drug. And so really what you get from the pharmaceutical side is almost an even distribution across the United States. What that means is that any cancer patient who has a specific, let's say, genetic mutation or a specific cancer type that is looking for a clinical trial, it's hard to find. It's almost like a needle in the haystack, because these things have been spread out all over, and you can't use reputation to find it. If the oncologist doesn't have it in their own hands, they're unlikely to know that the clinical trial even exists. There's no time nor tools for them to find these things. And so how does a patient know? I'll just leave you with the fact that there is a clinical trials database that the government has created. They've done it more so from a registrational perspective. So there's a regulatory or a sort of a permission-based system in the FDA that regulates and says you must post your clinical trial to this website called clinicaltrials.gov. However, it's really not meant or designed to be searched. And so while cancer patients will go and others will go, family members, even their physicians sometimes will go, it takes hours to sift through that. And it's very complex. So at the end of the day, we don't see patients on average being able to come out with good solutions from that. We've developed a better system so that we make that far more efficient, and we can get patients to the trials that really pose an opportunity for them to do better.
Yeah, I just to speak to it a little bit, at Sage Health, that's kind of what we've done. As a big part of what we're doing is we've taken the clinicaltrials.gov, which, we welcome patients to go search and see what you find there. But you're going to find a lot of medical jargon. You're going to find a lot of terminology that really is shorthand understood between researchers and physicians. So it's very hard to, even if you know a cancer type or a stage, to really sort through it. I mean, the work that we've done over the last, 8 years to kind of make this and meld this into something useful, it's remarkable how complicated that will seem to a patient and how inaccessible that is.
I want to jump in because, from my perspective, it is extraordinarily difficult. I mean, I'm a cancer trained expert who's been doing this for many years. And when I did this manually, it would take me 50 hours to get through even one cancer patient's situation. You mentioned the complexity, but in each of these trials is a list, and oftentimes there's 20 or 30 items in these lists of inclusion and exclusion criteria. So, it may start with, does the patient have colon cancer? Pretty easy. Well, what stage is it? You start to get into does the patient have had a history of a heart problem in the last 6 months? How about a year? I mean, you get into all of these very specific situations. It becomes very hard to get through any volume of these in any sort of speed. So again, hours and hours that we see there. It's part of the reason that we've created the system we have to quickly get through and answer the questions that are most important and get patients on their way to the physicians who have them. Oftentimes, not all of those criteria are posted online. And so it's better to get in front of the doctor fairly soon who's got a clinical trial that does match you in order to really know, is that the right option for you?
Yeah, that's a really important point I want to go into, which is most people, when they go to their local oncologist, their community oncologist, maybe their local hospital, the chances of them having a clinical trial to offer at all versus a clinical trial that's a good match for you versus a clinical trial that is extremely promising given your situation. These are just extremely unlikely, and more unlikely. And so what should a patient do? I mean, obviously they can come to Sagely Health. This is what we do. We'll basically figure out which doctors they should see, which trials are of interest, or what is the underlying interventions in trials that might be of interest, that might be accessible.
Yeah.
But what should a patient do if they're hearing this today? What gives them the best chance of reaching a trial?
Right. And I just wanted to say first that, the physicians that hold these trials and are running these trials, they are expert, right? They're being given these trials because they have expertise in this area. Whether the area is a specific cancer type or whether it's a genetic mutation. You remember that we've had a patient who had a RAD51 mutation, and we found this doctor who is all about RAD51 mutations. He's studying his whole life on that. And is responding on a Sunday night because he's so excited to be able to test a new therapy that he believes is going to work in these patients, with that very narrow focus. And so they are the experts. And what I mentioned before about getting in front of an expert who has one of these trials, they may say, yes, the trial fits you. They may say the trial doesn't. You're going to benefit. The patient will benefit by being with that doctor who has sort of declared themselves as an expert in that field on the basis that they have the clinical trial and they've been awarded with that. And so we use clinical trials sort of in multiple different ways. The easiest way, obviously, is when patients get on trials, but we use them in other ways as well. We'll use them to find those experts who are a match for treating those patients in the best way possible. We also use clinical trials as an example for physicians who may not have the trial to say, look at what's being done out there. Do this, right? Or think about, please consider doing any of these things. That, again, is the future of medicine today. And sometimes it works. So, we can switch into, the next topic, but, from my perspective, it's really important to know that getting to a doctor with a clinical trial is not only for getting on the clinical trial, but has other benefits as well.
Right. You've met an expert who has been granted, clinical trials, very important responsibility because of their ability and probably their colleagues' ability at that medical center. So, yeah, I think you answered what I was kind of looking at. I mean, there are large medical centers, many of them academic medical centers that offer trials. Other trials are spread across the country. I was looking a couple of weeks ago. We had that map feature that we'd worked on, and so I was looking at kind of across the United States for metastatic breast cancer. And so it was amazing. It really did cover all 50 states, Alaska, Hawaii, everywhere there was something available. And then you start to get into, well, what if it's just it's metastatic breast cancer, but they're MSI high, or they have, BRCA, or there's something, and suddenly the distribution is still there, but it's fewer, right? And so they're spread out. So, and I'm noticing you could be at a really good academic medical center, but the right trial for you, unfortunately, is the other good medical center that's like an hour's drive away. And I mean, that's just infuriating because a lot of cancer patients don't have anything to do sometimes except chase reputation. I mean, we all know some of the names, Mayo, MD Anderson, these are Dana-Farber. It's just, there are places that but it doesn't, with how complicated the system is, it doesn't guarantee the best match.
Right. As a matter of fact, it won't, not only does it not guarantee, but it's unlikely that you're going to find the best match without having someone on your side to try to figure that out with you, for you, and present you with sort of that understanding of, okay, this is the cancer center nearest me. And again, in Boston, it may only be 5 minutes away, right, to get to actually 5 or 6 excellent cancer centers. And they're all excellent, right? Dana-Farber, MD Anderson, MSK, they're all great, Mayo Clinic. But you don't want just great. You want the one that's going to be great for you. And really, to me, the best way to know that is to do this search. And then to come out on the other side with a very short list of trials that are the closest match and have the best possibility of benefiting the patient. We know that because sometimes there's early data being published on these. And so we know, bladder cancer, immunotherapy, yes, let's go for that. And so we send the patient specifically to specific hospitals, again, great reputations, with specific cancer doctors who we know have the trial to offer. And again, other doctors, even in the same department, may not know. And we give them the questions, the patients, the questions they should ask of their doctor and others, especially this other doctor, if it is a different doctor, that really gets them access to the clinical trial and or the innovative therapies being given in that trial setting. And again, it's this combination that we found over the last 8 years to work fantastically well. And that's why we were able to get 2 years or more of life benefit, for our clients. It's really exciting. And we want that to happen for every cancer patient.
So I hope we've convinced people that clinical trials are worth a look, and especially getting matched to the right clinical trial can really make a difference in your life. So let's talk about a couple logistics. Do patients have to pay for clinical trials? Do they get paid to participate in clinical trials? Like, what's the bottom line for patients when thinking about it? Because you're selling me something that it sounds right. Like, you get on a clinical trial, you might get innovative care that's really good for you, or you might get the standard in a good environment by really well-trained professionals. So it seems like a good thing. So what are the financials for a patient when it comes to clinical trials?
Yeah. And let me just touch a little bit on a few of those other points, and we'll definitely get to the financials. So, from my perspective, clinical trials are not only offer the medicine, but there are other benefits. One of those benefits is, again, because they are run in a very specific, sort of tightly regulated way, the cancer patient will know that they'll be seeing a physician each and every time they walk into that clinic. And so, again, that is part of the regulations, and it's also being paid for by the drug company. So in a sense, you get that extra special care when you're on a clinical trial. You may be in a special place, like a dedicated research unit. There could be other sort of niceties that go beyond. But those niceties actually matter. And at the end of the day, it does help to make sure cancer patients being cared for as well as possible. On the financial side, it's very interesting. I mean, for a large these trials are being paid for by the drug companies, by the pharmaceutical companies that are trying to develop these drugs. So cancer patients know that they will get the drug free of charge. Now, cancer care involves a lot more than just receiving the drug. And so, there are situations where the patient's insurance company will pick up the bill on other aspects of sort of what's considered standard within that, that CT scan, maybe if a side effect happens. But again, the insurance company pays for that. There are out-of-pocket costs for cancer patients, and these happen in sort of the cracks of the system. But unfortunately, for cancer patients, they can be large chasms. So traveling, for example, staying in a hotel, and nearby the center, especially for the early days of an early clinical trial, you may be expected to go for the first week on an almost daily basis. Now, usually it gets easier fast, and the drug companies work hard at that. But just know that there are out-of-pocket costs. I just wanted to leave patients with the knowledge that many of these trials today offer reimbursement for patients who have out-of-pocket costs. And patients need to ask about it because they will not be told about it. Again, one of the vestiges of sort of the way clinical trials were done years ago was, we have to be very careful not to incentivize patients to want to join a trial just to be paid. So we're going to tell them in every way, shape, and form in this consent form that, there's no money coming to them. And again, in cancer, it just makes me hold my head. It just does not apply, obviously. No one is faking cancer to go get a cancer medicine. Therefore, again, the system does its best to work around this. Where they've gotten to is that most of these hospitals will have a reimbursement budget. They are the ones who implement that budget. The drug company is hands off, and they do that to be unbiased. But the hospital will also not tell a patient about it unless they're asked. And sometimes they'll even deny it until after the consent is signed. And then they'll turn around and say, oh, by the way, we'll cover your air flight here. We'll cover your hotel stay. We have a hotel that we've contracted down the street that won't charge you. All of these things exist.
Right. So but in a regulatory way, they're not really allowed to promise any of those things sometimes prior to the consent being signed.
Now, obviously, we know which centers have those things. And so sometimes we, by virtue of experience, can say, yes, try going to the NCI. The Donald McDonald Center across the street is one that is there for those patients. You will, as long as you can register there, you'll have you'll be able to stay for free. So we know about some of these, and we learn others from cancer patients and their experiences. But we're looking at, again, building this network, this sort of experience to be able to benefit patients so they know where they can get the best help from. And that's what we're aligned to giving them.
So we've gone over what we planned for time, but I do have one last question I want to ask you, which is around when a patient should consider a clinical trial. I mean, we're ringing the bell for clinical trials in general, but a patient is diagnosed, and they might be diagnosed at an early stage or a late stage. They might have the cancer may have spread or metastasized or not, and then they may be treated, and they may have surgery, and the cancer may come back later. So when in this entire kind of process and journey should a cancer patient consider clinical trials?
Yeah. So we believe that cancer patients should consider a clinical trial each and every step of the way. As soon as they're diagnosed, or even when they suspect that they might have cancer, looking and getting help and looking at what's out there, if the cancer is confirmed, is of benefit for them. Right? They may be put onto the standard of care. They may be randomized to the standard of care arm. But imagine if they're randomized to a standard of care plus a new therapy, which we've already seen in several trials is working. They're going to just benefit more. And that only gets better each of the steps after that. So every time the cancer, should it come back, recur, or grow, looking again, seeing what clinical trials are there for the patient, are there for you, is really the best way to battle cancer and eventually defeat it. However, I have to say that unfortunately the system is not yet aligned to that methodology. Again, from a vestiges of old, the system has arisen organically in a way that is financially incentivized. Right? So the oncologist, the community oncologist, or even the academic oncologist who doesn't have a clinical trial to offer the patient isn't sending them outside their door to some other hospital or some other doctor. They're going to give them the best treatment that they have. That best treatment will be standard of care. We have another segment that we talked about how all oncologists use the NCCN, which is the national guidelines to determining what the cancer standard of care is. And so that's what they're going to give. And if you get a second opinion from another doctor, another oncologist who has another clinical trial, you'll get the same answer. So we want patients to get to a doctor who has something special to offer, has one of these clinical trials. And then let's see what happens. Right?
Yeah, I mean, just to underline that, the patients that get on clinical trials are kind of two groups. They are the extremely, and I don't use this word lightly with cancer patients, lucky. They just ended up at the right cancer center. And this is the story. Most medical centers will have a video somewhere on their website, somewhere on their cancer pages, that will tell the story of a patient who was at the medical center already, happened to be at clinical trials down the hall. That was a perfect match for them. And boy, that immunotherapy, that did so much better than what the standard of care would have done. And what a great story. And it is. Yeah. But there was no reason particularly that cancer patient ended up there. And the other segment would say, and this is the other one, is the extremely proactive. The person who basically becomes a cancer expert in the weeks and months after their diagnosis. They track down experts. They talk to everyone. They're the one who ends up in the expert's room who says to them, oh, yes, I am running clinical trials for your cancer and your gene type. And so Sage Health exists to create a third group, everyone else. That everyone else can kind of get to the right person, and they don't need to become an expert, and they don't need to be lucky. They just need to have found Sagely Health and kind of get matched and be kind of pushed to the right place.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. From our perspective, the chances of, again, randomly finding this, it's serendipity, right? It's just completely up to chance. We want to defeat serendipity. We want to make serendipity and turn it into certainty, right? In our hands, we are taking that group of patients who otherwise would not have ever looked at a clinical trial, certainly would not have looked at the right clinical trial at the right location with the right doctor, and we make sure that they do. And we give them the questions and put the questions in their hands to facilitate access to that clinical trial. We know what questions to ask, are happy to tell patients about them, but when the doctor sees the clinical trial that we're talking about, sees the questions, and how to consider this, they're oftentimes saying yes. Again, more than 90% of the time, patients are coming out with a change in their their roadmap, their therapy direction on the account of what we're supplying them with, what we're giving them, and the instructions that we give them. And again, we want to do this for every cancer patient. We believe every cancer patient deserves it, and that's why we exist.
I think that's a good place to end it. If anyone is interested in learning more about clinical trials or would like to talk about the service Sagely Health provides, we're at clinicaltrials.gov. And please reach out. We'd love to help.
Absolutely. Thanks
Great.
a lot, Jeremy.
Thank you, Jason.